Hey guys, so welcome to the first video that you've seen, a lecture video like this. I'm going to do this one this time, and I might even, depending on how long this goes, I might even try and squeeze in like the next one so you guys can have over these 2 weeks while I'm gone a little bit more introduction to the skill part of it, because I know some of us have been kind of anxious to like, let's get going. We feel like we're not learning stuff that we want to learn fast enough. So with that said, we'll see how far we can get. The other thing is, if you guys like this kind of style of video, I feel like I've been trying to cram too much lectures, activities, group practice in the rooms. It just seems like there's too much. And I was actually worried at the very beginning that I wouldn't have enough, that I wouldn't cover enough time or, fill the time well enough. So if you have any thoughts about like, you'd like me to do more of these videos, you'd like to lecture this way and have more time in class for activities, something like that, feel free to let me know how you think this works in the reflection quiz. And then I can read that feedback and go ahead and record more videos or just show up to class ready to do other things, whatever. So anyway, your feedback is welcome and I'd love to hear it. That's the point. So without further ado, let's get into this. So this is kind of our first introduction to the skill stuff. And I think we're still kind of asking this question, at least I'm intending to ask this question of how do we do this? What is this work about? And of course, the first part of the class has been very foundational of like, this is the kind of presence you bring. This is the kind of space we're trying to provide. Here's, and last week it was about culture, which is highly, I guess, when it comes to culture, here are the things that can get in the way of a good therapeutic space. But we haven't really talked about the skills, and now we're finally into it. So let's start with this question up top. Why invite people to share their pain? Even if there wasn't a counseling profession, this idea of people need to experience life together, the good and the bad, or the easy and the hard, all of the parts of it together. We're social people and we just need to do that. So why are we continuing to do that? Well, I think it was in this class, or maybe it was another one where we were talking about ways in which that's historically been done. And one of them is confessional. Like I don't know how many of you are Catholic, but confessional and many things like that. It's not just for priests, but shaman healers and, group leaders, tribal leaders, and, elders is another sort of traditional way in which people have said, well, go take that to the elders, people who have been through the pain of life, can tolerate your pain and can help you, guide you through it, something like that. There's always been this kind of idea. So the idea is a place where people can either release their burdens and find comfort, or talk to somebody about situations they've been through and find solutions to get there too. Again, here these same kind of themes come up of, do you need comfort or do you need solutions? Some people will come in saying, I want answers. And really they just need comfort. And other people say like, I just need you to hear me, but I'm not getting any better and I'm not making changes in my life and probably need to do some things differently and don't know how. So could be either of those things in terms of how you get feedback. But either way, it's some combination of that equation. So you'll hear me using those words a lot. Other people use different words, but similar kind of thing. Do you need help with something to figure it out? Do you want to fix a problem? Or do you just need to be heard, validated, whatever, comforted? People seek shared experience. I think that's kind of self-explanatory and goes without saying much more about that. The one thing to know is that so many of us, I think we want to learn the techniques and we want to be able to say the right things and have the skills. And so much of the benefit of counseling comes from just the shared experience. Sharing itself is therapeutic. If you've ever called your best friend on the phone and told them about your broken heart that you just got, or talked to a parent or an older person or just anybody else who could listen, sometimes provide solutions, sometimes just listen and provide comfort. But even just that itself is therapeutic. It doesn't have to be from a professional. Sometimes I think as professionals, I think we have to have all these acronym words and these fancy techniques, EMDR, movement back and forth and tapping something, whatever. But from my perspective and from the field's perspective, a lot of the work is done by just making those foundational attachments. Okay. So remember that if you don't feel like you're doing anything, it doesn't mean that nothing is happening. Right. And actually, you've all probably been in the room with somebody who's really comfortable, who feels like they're life-giving and who just expresses this, it's okay to be around. that is something that takes work to get there, and it takes work to continue to do. In other words, you have to take care of yourself so you can be in a position to be someone who other people want around, who can benefit from being around you, right? So it's not like you're doing nothing if you're just in a space and other people are like, I just feel like I'm getting it when I'm around them. That's important, right? If you don't know that you're doing it and don't know how to do it, and you're like, I can just rely on people being in the presence of my greatness, that's not quite what we're, that's not quite the same thing, not quite what we're going for, right? So it takes a while to really fully understand. And to be honest, I'm still learning this of like, how do I get myself to be in the space where other people can benefit from being around it? What does that mean? And what do I need to do to keep myself in that place? So moving on, I guess. By the way, one of the things you guys haven't seen me do yet is that I'll try and get myself out of the way so you can actually see the words behind me, because other people have said that's necessary to do. So it's just a fancy little thing that I click here on my computer. If you need to read this, pause it, whatever. I'll try not to do it too much. It's not terribly distracting, but a quote pulling out of the book: most people don't want others to solve their problems. You go to someone for help because when we're hurting, when we're in pain, we go and we ask for somebody's help. And yet we really want the capacity to do it ourselves. And some of the reason I think some people decide not to go to counseling is because I should be self-reliant. I should be able to take care of this. I should be able to do it myself. I don't need anybody else's help. I don't want to include anybody in my problems. It's just going to make it worse. And there's so many things like that that keep us from living shared experience with other people. With that said, they will come and ask you for solutions. They want the medicine. They want the cast put on. They want you to do the work for them. But they really don't. It's kind of like kids saying, I just want you to let me go play with my friends. But what I'd really like is for you to set good, hard boundaries so that I know what's okay and what's not okay, so that I grow up safe and healthy, and I know how to do that with my children. See what I mean? Like sometimes we don't know what we want because we don't know what's good for us, especially when we're not in the best frame of mind and we're making decisions from our pain, not from our own sense of maturity or groundedness or something. So keep that in mind. That's really, it seems like kind of one of those like obvious statements, but it's really, really important. And you'll find yourself coming back to this. Is it my responsibility to do this work for them, or my responsibility to help them get to a place where they know it's their job to work themselves out of this? It's a hard question. It's harder. It's deceitfully simple just looking at this. One of the biggest distractions, I think we've talked about this in class too, but one of the biggest distractions is our need to help. In other words, part of the reason the beginning of this class has been so frustrating, I don't know if it's terribly frustrating, but part of the reason it can be frustrating is that we just want to do so good by other people. I'm going to pull this caption down so it doesn't cut off quite so much. We want to do right by people. We want to help them. We want to be useful. And sometimes that says more about our own sense of being needed than our ability to help other people. I can tell you just from me personally, when I feel like I'm not doing as well in life, it really does give me a sense of, it's not a high, there's some kind of reward and I don't know what it is. But when I do a good job and do something for other people and like contribute back to them, or people really appreciate me, that gives me a sense of, it's a kind of like a warm, fuzzy feeling. When I'm in a really good place and I can help people, it doesn't hit the same because I don't need it to hit the same. You know what I mean? So I'm starting to recognize in me, and when I talk to other people too, this sort of reflects this way, is there is a sense that when people want to be helpful and they need to be needed, it comes from a wrong place and it ends up turning out to be not the most helpful anyway. But when someone says, hey, I'll give you the space and it's really all for you, I'm not seeking any kind of validation or reward in return, it does look different and it's experienced different. It means this is for you, the client, the child, my nephew or whatever it is, niece. So this is another one of those probably more powerful than we give it credit kind of statements. The biggest distractions is our need to help. Once you get over the sense of like, I need to do this, I want to do this, this is my career, I'm so excited about it, and you can be there at this point, and it's totally fine. But once you get to the place where you say, I know I'm helpful, I know I can help people, and I know how it works, it doesn't happen for a while. But once you get there, and you sit with people, it really starts to be more effective because it's less about you needing to be helpful. And of course, you have skills and confidence and all that kind of stuff with it. But it becomes more about another person and just giving space for them to do their work, and then also helping guide them through the process too, which we'll get there. So I already mentioned this last line too, so we don't need to cover that one again. Oh, there. I actually clicked the right things. So the question is, what are these building blocks? Now, I'm going to give you the building blocks that are part of this class. In order to know, think of this way. If you're going to go on a trip, you'd need to have some, I don't know if this is going to be a good analogy or not, but I'll try it out because I haven't thought this one through really. But if you're going to go on a trip, you need to have a map, and you also need to have supplies. So in your supply bag, in your backpack or suitcase or whatever, you have to have like toothbrushes and clothes and, you know, a wallet and a phone and whatever else you need to get around. And the map is like your guidepost. One of the things we're not going to talk a ton about right now, we will a little bit later in the semester, is theory. You guys have a theory class. Your theory class is like your map. What roads do I need to take to get to this end destination? And having known what that end destination is, a person's wellness, a sense of self-esteem, a belongingness with other people, a sense of purpose, all that kind of stuff. That's the destination. And the map gives us a way to kind of navigate through that. But the skills are like the little things we fit in our suitcase. If I'm not making eye contact with somebody, I don't have the toothbrush that I need while I'm traveling, right? So these kind of things behind me are those little the required resources that you have available to you. But there's other important parts to it as well. So eye contact. We've already talked about eye contact. We've done some exercises and activities. It doesn't mean you have to stare awkwardly at people, but you can't not see them. You know what I mean? Sometimes you'll have, I don't know if you guys have ever been sad or angry in your life, but well, not so much angry, because when you're angry, you kind of want to get people's attention and fit right into their space. But when you're sad, the last thing you want to do is be a bother. You kind of want people, but you don't want them, and you're not really sure, and you just hurt, right? But there's not a whole lot of seeking people out and trying to make eye contact and asking for support and love and connection. That's why it's so important when you have that available to you. You can say, hey, I see you, and I'm watching you. So watch eye contact. This is something I constantly have to remind myself that, like, if I want to be connective, I have to make eye contact, right? Because I can get stuck in my head and be really rational and be like, yeah, I love people. I'm in a good mood. Everything's fine. My life is good. And I'm like, but that doesn't mean I want to be with people. I'm not showing them. I'm not making those invitations. Facilitative body position. We're going to cover more of these too, by the way, so we'll talk more about them. So maybe I should go through them a little quicker. I pulled these two charts out of your book, so you have these available to you. Facilitative body position. We've already talked about body stuff, so we'll kind of skip over that one a little bit. Appropriate use of silence. This one will come up again and again later. I actually think appropriate use of silence is an advanced skill that you have to start with an introduction. It's like when you teach kids to play basketball and you're like, let's shoot some 3-pointers, you know, or like, I don't know, like free throws or something. It takes a long time to get really good at them, and it's hard to be consistent. You can throw the ball up at the hoop and you can make silent space, but whether it lands or not is a different thing. One of the things I'm going to try and get a hold of, I'm not sure if I will have done it by the time you watch this, but there's a video of a guy named John Summers Flanagan, who's like, apparently people love him and he's been around in the field. He's made these videos. In one of the videos, he has this moment where he just totally uses silence wrong and it gets awkward. And then he talks about it afterwards of like, yeah, I messed that up. It does not work. It didn't work. It didn't land. It wasn't that I don't know how to do it. He's skilled. But he used it at a time when it didn't really work. It's like saying, you know, an all-star baseball player struck out. Well, that person can hit home runs, but they still strike out sometimes, right? So like we all make those mistakes. Silence is one that you're going to make the mistakes. It's going to be either used too much or too little, and that's just part of it. Voice tone. I'd like to talk about that one maybe more in class or something, but there's depending on how much, it almost feels like being an actor. but sometimes your voice tone, if you're really high pitched like this, and sometimes you sound kind of like you maybe don't know what you're talking about, or like really kind of like it's super cute, but it doesn't, it doesn't instill a lot of confidence in people. See what I mean? Or if I'm just really kind of low and don't, my voice it doesn't really, I might be talking just as fast, but the tone is so low that it almost lulls people. So there's a time for comfort when you want low tone, and there's a time for excitement when things get a little higher and more exciting, when you want to laugh with people. So those are just kind of an example of how you can get really intentional about using your tone of voice. Nonverbal encouragers, I'm going to skip that one for now, but you guys are doing a lot of this, and this is what I'm trying to give you feedback in class too, of like, I'm with you, I'm seeing it. Oh yeah, I really feel what's going on in your story. And, when people are saying something really sad, you can slouch down with them, and you can, if they're saying something, you can nod on to say like, yeah, keep going. What is this? Sometimes I even, I use my hands sometimes, and I'm like, this is like, I'm encouraging you to say more. So that's just an example. Opening skills, that's right behind me. I'll get out of the way in just a second so you can see all of these. By the way, I'm looking at a few different things off screen. So if you see my eyes darting from side to side, I'm reading the slides from over here, but I'm seeing what I'm in the way of over there. So it's pretty fancy. I don't want to brag about it, but it's pretty fancy. Just kidding. It's also really weird. If you want to come up to my office, you can see all this stuff. It's really kind of fun. You can make your own videos and show off to your friends if you want to. Anyway, opening skills are the verbal and non-verbal encouragers or questions. They ask clients to explore a little deeper, but are not invasive. This question came up of like, how much do you dig? How do you know? And when do you go deeper? When do you stay on the surface? We'll get much more practice in that, because that's one of those things, again, foundational, but also really tricky to get good at. And when to know when to get deeper and when to not. So examples of encouragers are something called a door opener, and that's where I'm going to get myself out of the way. Door openers are, say some more about that. Like you're starting a new topic of conversation, or it's also like when people first come in, you're like, oh, how have you been? What's going on today? Let's check in about the last week. There's sort of like the opener of a topic or of a session or something. Minimal encouragers, very similar to nonverbal encouragers. It's okay, sure. And it's just those phrases that say, I'm not asking for more information. I'm not even saying anything that conveys a whole lot of meaning, but it's just, I'm with you, keep talking. I'm encouraging you to say more, do more, keep going in that direction. And then questions. Most people know the difference between an open and closed question. The question is, do you know how well to use them? So closed questions can be answered with yes or no answers. Open questions are explore more, give me more content, that kind of stuff. So we'll talk more about those in practice as we're going. I'll probably give you feedback, or you'll notice feedback for each other when you're doing this, of like, you asked a closed question and then they stopped, and then you came up with another question, even if it was an open question and they stopped. And then you said, oh, I got to ask more open questions. So you ask another question, they stop. Those are the kind of situations where we're like, well, let's figure out then what kind of questions work better in certain situations. Just a quick little something to keep in mind is, if you're doing an assessment or an interview at the very initial stages of counseling, especially when you get to practicum and you're doing like an intake and you need to get some information, you're going to do a lot more closed questioning than you are open questioning. Once you have all the information that you need to make a diagnosis, to make a treatment plan, to understand the details of the situation well enough to be able to respond to them, then you can transition to more open questions. Doesn't mean exclusively ask closed questions, but so there's an art to this. Okay. So we'll get a lot more practice with those, but that's just one of the lists. So now that you've seen those, where do you start? Remember, this is the lecture called Invitational Skills. So all of the things I just showed you are, let's invite people to either start somewhere or keep going down that road. And we're going to use other skills later on to navigate that a little bit more. But where do you start? So this is like we've just met a person. Even when you guys are in your rooms and your groups together, you guys don't know each other that well, probably. Some of you do more than others, but we're still relatively new to each other, even if we've heard a few things about a person's life, right? So I think the spirit of let the client tell their whole story or as much as they need, the spirit of that is, how do you know when you have enough information to make to have an understanding of what's going on? One of the things I'll tell you is that it's amazing to be around somebody who, within just a few minutes or, half a session or whatever, they really seem like they just get it. Like they've done an assessment and they say, I think I understand your clinical condition, potential diagnoses, and I really see the relational dynamics that you're talking about. And I think I can help you. And here's what this might look like. Somebody who's really skilled can do that really fast. So how much of the story you actually need? Well, at first, you're probably going to need to ask a lot of details, a lot of some situations, names, places, timelines. You need to know the story. One of the mistakes that we make is either we think we understand when we really don't, we need to explore more, or on the opposite side of that spectrum, we explore, and we need to really just stop and make some conclusions. And depending on you personally, you might be on one side of that spectrum or the other. And as a spectrum, of course, we're probably all closer to the middle. But just keep that in mind. How do I know when I have enough information? And how do I know when I'm just stalling because I'm not sure what to do with it? So something to think about. If the client hasn't told you their whole story, by whole, that's the $1 million question part of that. But if you don't know the whole story, let them keep going, right? So remember last week I said, if in doubt, stop talking. That's really the way to be a good listener is to stop talking, that kind of thing. So anyway, this will come up again too. So I'll just stop there and kind of leave those details. I guess it's worth maybe mentioning too that when I mention these things, I think I've said this a couple times, maybe I'll just stop saying it, but so much of this is so hard that you take in this little, this sentence and another sentence and another sentence, and they're all going to be like, how do these fit together? And then how do I facilitate this? Once you get really good at this, in a couple of years, you'll look back on this stuff and you'll be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I know how to do that. But how you actually implement that is kind of a hard process to getting really good at this stuff. So if you're like, it feels like a lot, and I'm not sure how to do it intentionally, that's okay. All right. But you will look back on stuff like this if you ever choose to look back on it and say like, oh yeah, it makes sense now, like it didn't before. And I'm not even sure how I got here, but we will be practicing intentionally how to get there. It's not always easy to describe it. So watch your face. I think it was Allie who said like, oh yeah, I sometimes have RBF. I was in a meeting just a little bit ago, like half hour before I'm recording this. And I looked up at the screen, I saw myself and I had this like, like one of those kind of looks. And I was like, that's not how I feel on the inside. But it is when I'm recording this, it's Monday morning and this weekend was really busy and I'm still kind of in recovery from busy weekend. And Monday's just like that, right? So like getting really aware of what your face is doing, not only just your body posture and that kind of stuff. We have sometimes focus on our legs and our hands because we can see those, but we have a harder time seeing our face. So we hate looking at it too, but the more often that you can have look at your recordings, watch yourself on camera if you ever are on screen very much, like with your friends on phone calls and stuff, like just get a better sense of what your face is doing. When we do our recordings here, that's part of why we're recording it, so we can look at those things. But also you can just do some practice, practice going in the mirror. It's super weird and it's so awkward. I still do this sometimes when I'm having a bad day. I'll go in the mirror and I'll say, what is my face telling me about the way I feel on the inside? When I'm having a good day, I say, okay, I'm going in with a client. This is the face that looks warm, happy, and here's how it feels to project it and that kind of stuff. So it's something that I do. I don't do a ton of it anymore, but it's, I have in the past. Also, this line right behind my head, portraying emotional cues through facial expressions is perhaps more important than words. One of the things I don't think I did a good job of that first week when I was talking about the developmental attachment throughout the lifespan is that we spend at least the first year of our life building our brain and building our attachment relationship without really knowing language, without really understanding a whole lot about the world. But what we do understand is how it feels when we're with people. We feel safety. We don't understand safety. So portraying emotional cues, like projecting a sense. Sometimes Jen has this thing that she uses, and I think we'll probably introduce it in class at some point, but it's called the ways paradigm. Another way of saying that is, what ways are you showing up with people? I show up this way or that way, and there are these different parts to it. That'll make more sense later. But when we use words like presence projects emotional cues to other people of how they can interpret you. So if you're projecting a sense of warmth, how is that coming out? Well, it's through your words, through the your nonverbal body posture and all that kind of stuff. And all of that put together portrays a feeling. All right. People come in with a lot of their own misconceptions, a lot of their own feelings, but knowing that you're projecting a sense of openness, connection, belonging, non-judgment, and all that kind of stuff, that's what we're really trying to get really good at. Part of the reason why it's so confusing is because it's hard to do and hard to explain. Okay. So that's, again, why I'm giving you all this information and say, okay, now let's calm down. Let's get out of our heads. Let's just sit and enjoy the company and the presence of another person. And that in itself is connective and does a lot of the heavy lifting. We just, again, get in our own way, right? So it's about emotional cues that we're trying to get a sense of how to project those. This part that's right behind me here too, it can be hard for people to read. That's part of the reason why people come to counseling, because they don't know how to read emotional cues. They don't know how to connect to people, or people have given them the sense that what it means to be attached is actually painful, right? That's an attachment injury. So people are just not really that good at this. And if you think, oh my gosh, I'm not good at this either, I don't really know what that's about, it's okay, because most people aren't. That's what makes us unique. And that's why we're practicing it as a profession, so that we can get out there and say, hey, I know that you're hurting, or I suspect that you're hurting, and I don't know how it is, but I'm willing to sit here and listen to it. And I want to talk to you about it. And I want to help you feel better. And I know it's hard for you to do that. And it took me a while to practice that too, because I didn't get it. That's what this is about for you, starting that, not starting, but like continuing on that journey of how much more insight can I have about the ways in which people hurt and the things that I can uniquely do that they're not getting elsewhere to help them feel better about it. Something like that. So let's move on. So nonverbal skills. Eye contact, not too much, not too little. We talked about culturally appropriate eye contact last week a little bit, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that one. But you know there's a difference, right? And what that looks like. Watch how other people react to your eye contact to gauge their level of comfort. So if somebody comes in and they're just not looking at you, and I'm thinking there could be cultural reasons for it. There could be depressive reasons for it, or diagnostic reasons. There's also, it's not, I don't know if it's diagnostic or personality, but people like on the autism spectrum or identify as neurodivergent. Sometimes you're just not going to get a lot of eye contact, but it doesn't signify dysfunction. It might signify that it doesn't work for them, and it's not going to work in their social life, and it's going to create hazards for them, or impairments or something like that. But the question is, are we going to work on making better eye contact, or I just come to not expect it, right? You can adjust how much you expect from people and how much you give to them. And the question is, how do you know when it's happening right? When it's not working, right? So if you're making really good solid eye contact and people are freaking out and like trying to avoid you, then you're probably coming on too strong. That means that you can tone it back a little bit, even if you think you're, like Aaron said, you're supposed to make good eye contact, right? Well, yeah. And if it's not working, don't do it, right? That's one of the things about, I think, the feedback we get here early in this program is that if you hear something from me, if you take it as gospel and say, well, I need to make stronger eye contact, but then if it's not working, it's not working. And later on, I'll come back and be like, well, then don't do it. Ignore me. It's not about whether I think it's right or wrong. It's about, is it effective, right? So I just want to remind you of that. The book says this, and I think this is really helpful, is that eye contact forces intimacy and increases the ability to persuade. I'd be really curious for you guys to hear what you have to say about forces intimacy. Why would we want to force somebody into a situation? Shouldn't we give them the ability to do what's comfortable and what makes sense, whatever? Yeah, but if you go into the doctor's office and you say, I have a pain in my stomach, and they say, well, I'm not going to make you lift your shirt so I can observe you. But, if you wanted to, I'd be really interested to do an assessment. No, they're going to be like, well, lift your shirt for a second. Let me take a look. Right. And you're like, oh, this is awkward. It's uncomfortable. I'm going to show you my belly fat. You know what I mean? So it does force intimacy, and it's a good thing. And sometimes you need to, I'm going to say this a little lighter. I was going to say sometimes you need to force your way into this, but I don't want people to get the wrong impression of what that means. Sometimes you can be suggestive and assertive without being aggressive and forceful. Does that make sense? So suggesting like, hey, I'm going to ask you some really hard questions here. And I'm going to peel back these layers of onion, because everybody's watched Shrek. They know what that analogy means. They know that they want to do it, but they also don't really know what the experience is of it. So when you talk to people and you're like, hey, okay, I've asked about your family. I've asked about your relationships. I know a little bit about what you said about the conflict that you come in here talking about. I'm going to ask you some things that might be kind of uncomfortable, right? And you can do that. It forces intimacy, and the same with eye contact. Even without your questions or your comments, if you look people in the eye, oftentimes what do people do? Same thing you did. You either giggle or you look away because you're like, oh, I'm not comfortable with this closeness. But man, once you are comfortable and the trust starts to build, then you it's like a big bowl of ice cream. You just lap it up. You know what I mean? When you're with somebody you love, whether it's, a romantic partner or a parent or your best friend or something like that, and you can look them in the eye and say, I see you and you see me and this feels right. That's the kind of thing that we're trying to get to when we say force intimacy. So, body position, one of openness and acceptance. Sure, we've already talked about that, so I'm going to leave that one for now. Attentive silence. Here we go again with the silence thing. It can be very uncomfortable at first, but it can be effective if used at the right moments. So I've already mentioned that I'll try and give you that video or some more examples of this. When you're doing your first sessions, one of the things you can think about doing is just trying to leave a little bit of space, like silent space. You probably already have, I'm sure. It's one thing to leave space and be like, oh my gosh, I'm in my head. I don't know what question to ask. And But if you say, I'm just going to slow down here for a second. I'm going to leave some space to just sit with this. It's always good to do it. Not always. It's oftentimes good to do when there's emotions that are sitting right under the surface. Someone says like, I'm just sad today. And you're like, what are you sad about? Well, I did this thing, and tell your situation. And you hear that they're experiencing sadness, but you don't see it and you don't feel it. That's when you can practice this. Say, I'm going to help increase the emotional sensitivity or the emotional expression by just sitting in attentive silence. So just for example, do this for me. Think about how you're feeling right now. See where that is in your body. You feel tension somewhere in your nose, not your nose, your neck, your back, stomach. Are you driving? Do you feel any indigestion? Are you feeling giddy, silly, sad? And then how much are you willing to sit with that feeling? Because, and this is just a short demonstration, but if you're willing to sit with that, sometimes it allows it to sort of bubble up to the surface so they can just let it out like an infection that's been sitting there, just getting worse and not doing anything. And then it comes out and it's like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. Other times you get a good sense of how people cope because they move away from the feeling by changing the topic or trying to laugh it off or doing some sort of diversion tactic, which is just a way of coping. Like, I don't want to experience the pain, so I'm just going to try and avoid it. So this attentive silence, it can be uncomfortable. especially if you're talking about emotional things, but it can be effective to help people either learn about their coping or experience something that can be therapeutic, for lack of a better term, or cathartic is probably a better word. So I think that's probably enough for this slide. Talking about voice tone, one of your most important skills, okay? This is, remember when I was talking about being an actor earlier? There's a difference, there's a couple parts to tone. One of them is volume. So if you increase your volume, this takes a little practice, because a lot of us have just like learned to be a certain way, where we're like, this is just the way I talk. You mean you're suggesting that I not be my authentic self? And I'm like, no, that's not it. But you can be your authentic self while having a fuller range of expressive capacity. Okay. So loudness, when things are fun and exciting, oh my gosh, I get louder. And I'm not going to do it right now because there's people in my office behind me and on the other side behind the camera. And you can hear through these walls. So I'm not going to start screaming right now. But do you know what I mean? Like when things are fun, you're like, ah ha ha. If you ever hear somebody laughing in a restaurant and you're like, ugh, kind of loud and kind of obnoxious, but man, are they having a good time? I wish I was having a good time. I didn't care about how people felt about me. You get what I mean? When things get serious, or you're trying to initiate more closeness, again, culturally appropriate, but when things are getting that way, quieting down a little bit, getting real close. So one of the things I've done before, and I don't do it a lot, of course, in school when I'm teaching, but depending on the right client, if I start talking a little bit quieter, they kind of have to lean in, especially when people are just sad and depressed. They have to lean in a little bit. And so I'll lower the volume of my voice just so it's like, yeah, you almost can't even hear it. So I just say, hey, let's be together in these moments. Let's figure this part out, because this is hard. This is painful stuff. So I have my microphone set so that it can pick up low volume and decrease high volume. It's kind of like a noise suppression thing. But nevertheless, when you're in person, and you're with a person in person, you can use the volume to encourage different kinds of relationships. Also, there are people that when I need to set really firm boundaries, I'll get a little bit louder. Not too loud. You don't want to sound like you're screaming at people, but I will just increase the volume without changing my voice or my facial expression. So if I say like, okay, we need to have a conversation about our meetings. I know you want to see me every week, but I cannot see you every single week because I have other clients that I want to see. So here's what we're going to do. And that's really assertive, right? But I'm also hopefully expressing something that's positive and inviting, and also setting a very firm and clear boundary and sort of raising the volume without changing the expression, right? So volume can be separate from the energy that it projects, or the a certain emotion that comes with it. Okay, that's probably enough said for now. Cadence. Cadence is fluctuation of speed or inflection, okay? So it says here it's used, just get out of the way for a second. It's used for dramatic effect. If you ever listen to speeches, hear when people are speeding up and slowing down. You can hear it like whenever it's politics season, you hear people like, and we're going to change and we're going to do it and here we go. And they're talking really fast and they get all excited. And then when they really want to say something, it sinks in. Just need this to be heard. Slow down, put a little more time between their words and say, hear me, see me. This is the important part. So you see how that works when like what I just did, as I say, I'm gonna slow down, I'm gonna speed up. The way to use this intentionally, it's depending on the client. It's hard to give an example exactly right now of like how this works out in session. But like if I'm trying to increase emotional expression, that's when I don't necessarily leave huge gaps of silence, but I'll leave a little bit more silence in between words by slowing down. And I'll say, this hurts. This is not fun. Right? So you could just kind of feel, I don't know if you guys feel it, but the idea is to be able to kind of feel the tension rising, to give people opportunity to make that space to feel things differently. There are plenty of people who have so much energy who are just bringing a ton of like almost manic or anxious energy, that sometimes slowing down can help with that too. There's also times, and I'm going to talk about out of both sides of my mouth now, times when you want to match a person's energy to like get on the same page with them. So you speed up and you talk fast and you know what I mean? And then you intentionally use your like, okay, can I try something with you? Will you entertain me for, I don't know, at least a little bit? Do you feel me slowing down there a little bit? It's already kind of prepping a person to get ready for the slowdown, to say, yeah, anxiety, but we don't want to stay there. See what I mean? Okay, that's probably enough said. That'll take some more practice, but you can think about that periodically. And these are the kind of things we can give feedback to each other on, about how fast and how loud and how quiet. And I usually don't like to start the classes with that, because I don't want to be like, hey, the way you've lived your life and the personality you bring, let's do it differently. I don't like that. You know what I mean? Until I build a little rapport with you guys, I don't really start want to give them that kind of feedback, because you'd probably take it as a criticism and feel kind of bad about yourselves. So now that we've talked about it, what I want to suggest to you is that if I tell you these things, it's not because you're doing it wrong. It's because I want you to have the opportunity to practice how it could be used more effectively. Okay. And I'll probably have to reiterate that, because you've been told your whole lives, don't be that way, you know, or something along those lines, or you should be different from other people. What I'm going to suggest is if we can get really good at receiving feedback that isn't taken as you're not good enough or you're not doing it right, but more as here's an opportunity to build in something else. That's the goal here. Okay, facial expression. I don't want to say anything more about that, but we've already talked about it, I guess. Physical distance. I was just thinking about this in the car on the ride to work this morning. I was thinking about how very little touching I do for other people. In other words, I went into church this weekend. I go to church sometimes. The whole conversation, not particularly religious, but kind of, and I go to Bible studies and I do all that stuff. But you know, if you're like, oh, church is the worst, then don't worry, because I'm sometimes right there with you. But if you can set that conversation aside, I was going to church, and there's always a person at the door, and sometimes I just like, I can't stand the energy of like, cool, it's Sunday morning, my favorite day of the year, top of the morning to you, and I'm like, too much energy, dude. Just bring it down a little bit, please. It's not that easy for me to be here, so like, just calm just a little bit. Do you know what I mean? So like, too much intimacy of like, hey, I'm happy, I want you to be here, I'm so excited for you, and I want to be close to you, and I'm going to shake your hand. This is what I'm really getting at, is that handshake. I'm like, okay, sometimes too much, but also I really appreciate the closeness. And so we're not talking about like how it is about how close you sit to people, but it's also just like, how much invitation are you giving to share in physical space? Now, this is a whole conversation about what you're willing to do too, because some of us are not huggers, we're not touchers, we don't like germs, all that kind of stuff. But there is a conversation to be had about how much opportunity do you make to provide physical connection with people. Again, sometimes hugs, if they're appropriate in the right setting, but be very careful. Don't offer them unless you really know what you're doing. But a handshake is pretty benign, right? Like it could be a pretty culturally appropriate invitation, at least in most places, for my American self, I should say. So this is a conversation that's worth having, but just know that what we're trying to do is we're trying to, again, force that intimacy just a little bit more, just to say, this is right, this is okay, this is healthy, and we're fine here. Even if people are like, well, I'm not a toucher. I'm like, well, I'll still put my hand out. And if you want to say no, that's okay. But I want to be inviting, something like that. So lots to unpack there, but hopefully you get the idea. I guess there's even more of it. I don't know how much more I want to say about this. This sub point here can be used for therapeutic effect or convey sexual communication, or it can be misperceived as sexual communication. That's the tricky part. That's the stuff is like, you want to be able to provide connective experiences, because you know what it's like to get a hug from someone who loves you. You know what it's like when someone who really cares puts their hand on your shoulder and just, you know, Doesn't give you that awkward squeeze, but just a little bit of like, hey, I feel you. I'm here with you, that kind of thing. If you've ever experienced that, which I'm sure most of us probably have, it can be so powerful, and it communicates something more than words ever will, right? Or at least different. At the same time, you've been touched by someone who you're like, that I'm not familiar with those hands, and they feel very clammy and a little too squishy, or maybe too many calluses, or maybe you just like, give me the hug with the pat on the back that says, yeah, you're hugging me, but it doesn't feel very good. You know what I mean? Whatever it is, it can communicate the wrong thing even with the right intentions. That's why why we're trying to be so careful about it. One of the cautions is do not impose a greater level of intimacy than the client can handle. Okay. This is a hard thing to know, hard to know how much a client can handle. So there's probably a lot more to talk about there, but how can you get an indication of what the client can handle? Ask them, right? Ask them. And then negotiate through your conversations of how much you can force intimacy on somebody. So this is why this is so tricky. But when I said earlier, forced intimacy through physical touch, through eye contact, through whatever, I don't want to give the impression that we're trying to force, but we are trying to encourage more closeness, more trust, more bonding, more attachment, that kind of stuff. So you don't want to impose too much because the client will just shut down and move away. That's how we cope. We don't want too much intimacy because intimacy invites the potential for pain. We want to suggest a little bit more. And how do we know? We say, do you need a hug? No? Okay, that's fine. No big deal. Let's talk about something else. And you change the subject real quick so you don't have to, they're not like, oh, he felt bad that I said no, or you know what I mean? Which is also a really great conversation to have with people. So there's so much to say about that, but I don't want to take too long. But you don't want to impose too much. You want to do just a little bit, and you want to encourage more. Here's an analogy I think that might help. You ever been to the dentist, and the dentist says, okay, we're going to start going. Let me put some little topical, what is that? Like they put lidocaine or something on your gums, and they stab a needle into it and fill it up with Novocaine. And then they're like, okay, I'm going to start going here, and I'm going to get really into your mouth, and it's going to be kind of uncomfortable. You let me know if there's pain. Okay, I'm going to touch this. And they're like, oh, does that hurt? And you're like, yeah, more drugs. No, I'm kidding. That's not what you say. But you get the idea. What we're doing is we're checking in and saying, like, can I do a little bit more? A little bit more here? Can I ask about this thing that's a little more sensitive? Can I go a little further? Can I do this? It's really important that I get deep into your mouth in order to do this work, or deep into the heart or the mind. But along the way, I'm navigating. Okay, too much? Okay, let's take a step back. Let's take a step back. We'll take a little break, provide some anesthetic, and we'll hold off. And then we'll see if we can get back in there in a second or a minute or next time or whatever. So hopefully that analogy makes a little bit of sense. You want to get your way into someone's mouth or into their heart, but you got to check in with them. And intimacy, both emotionally and physically, can be one of the ways to do that. Again, we're not getting into romantic relationships. We're not sexual relationships. We're not talking about that kind of intimacy. It's a misunderstanding of what that word means and how it functions in the heart. And if you have questions about that, let's get those sorted out, because this sexual communication has been so messed up with the way we emotionally understand closeness that I'll tell you a quick story. We're at 48 minutes. I got to move on. How much longer? Oh, shoot. We got so many. Okay, I'll tell you a really quick story. I do these weird things and kind of quirky. You guys know me. I'm a little quirky and kind of, whatever. But it's oftentimes to encourage closeness, or like I really think inside jokes are really good for people sometimes, of like, it's just the thing that me and you know, and it's really something that's like just special between us, those kind of things. And there was this one girl, my first sort of professional big boy job, and I was working at a place where there were people with disabilities, and she had a disability, and it affected her kind of social maturity, so to speak. In other words, like missing social cues and stuff. And I did not recognize this, but she came in one day and I was like, hey, girl. Oh, no, that's not what I said. I said, hey, girlfriend, because I thought I was just being funny and silly, because I do with other people. And they're like, ha, 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 whatever, it's weird, but whatever. But she goes, I'm not your girlfriend. I have a boyfriend. No, thank you very much. And I was like, oh, that was actually a joke. I wasn't trying, but I was like fumbling over my words and I just didn't know what to say. It's so awkward. But the point is that I was trying to create a level of relational intimacy without it being romantic. And she did not pick up on that, which means I did it wrong, right? Like I just made that mistake. That's what we're trying to avoid here. But we want people to know, like, hey, I want to be friends. I want to have this, or not friends in a professional context, but I want to have this closeness. But really, I need to be able, and you need to be able to define how do you do it without it getting messed up with romance and sexuality and all that kind of stuff, right? Okay, probably enough said. Lastly, I'll just mention, avoid being patronizing. You know how that the greeter at the church who was like, hey, great to see you. I'm so glad you're here today, you know? And it kind of feels a little patronizing. Same thing with like little touches or pats or fake hugs. They don't, if you do it and it doesn't land, now you know, right? So we're trying to avoid being that. Lastly, warmth is communicated by getting good at using all of these nonverbals as well. I think that's probably self-explanatory. I'll get myself out of the way for a second, but I'm not going to go over all of these things. I think we've pretty much covered all the stuff in the chart behind me. It's in your book. You can read about them too. But, oops, hit the wrong button. Okay, opening skills. Go ahead, I'll leave this up to you. Go ahead and look on page 102. There's a bunch of examples. This is where, again, part of the challenge. When you're opening up with a client and you're starting to get to know somebody, you guys have, sorry, getting the hiccups a little bit. You guys are starting to ask these kinds of questions of like, how much do I talk versus how much do I let the clients talk? And what if they're talking too much? How do I step in? And what if they're talking too little? I have to come up with all these questions and be more directive. It's on a spectrum and it's dependent on the kind of client that you're seeing or the kind of person that's across from you. So it's hard to say like, well, how do you do this? Other than saying, again, it's on a spectrum of like, sometimes you get to be directive and you get to be more authoritative and assertive. I've even had somebody, I'm not going to name names here on camera, but I had one person say, I was giving feedback about being less directive and less confident and less assertive, because sometimes that can be off-putting to people, or it can be just ineffective in the way that they perceive you. Like, I don't want someone who's going to tell me how to do this and want to fix all my problems. I just need a listener or something along those lines. So I might give you just the opposite feedback depending on how you're presenting to that person, but it doesn't mean that what you're doing is wrong. Again, it's just, let's practice being effective in both ways. That's the point. So sometimes you're going to let the client lead. Sometimes you're going to need to interject, and sometimes even just rudely interrupt because you need to get in a word edgewise, right? Other times you need to be directive and confident and say, you know, this is how this works and this is how we're going to do this. Okay. Especially if you're working with kids, you can be a little more direct because they need you to be, they expect you to be. Depending on the level of vulnerability, more directive is necessary. So we haven't really talked about this too much, but you must listen to client stories, but you also need to provide your professional duties, which is like the informed consent, which we kind of practiced a little bit. I need to tell you the boundaries of what this is and what it isn't, but I really want to get to the good stuff. And so that's where you get to practice of like, how do I start a session that says, especially the first session, it's, I have to cover these things and I have to make sure that we're going along a guided process. So, but I also want to know about what you have to say about it too. So we'll get practice navigating through that a little bit as you go through the program. So ways to start, you must have a continuous thread from one session to the next. Part of the reason we take notes is so we can say, well, last time you talked about this. Tell me about that. How's that going? There's a formal expectation that you have sort of a treatment plan, and from one session to the next, you're tracking and following along. There's also informal, like, I just remember you, and you matter enough to me for me to remember the details of your life. I've had times, especially when I was in school, where I'm just functioning on little sleep, and actually I still do this sometimes, but like functioning on little sleep and you forget certain details, and then you make mistakes about like clients like, oh yeah, I told you this last time, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't remember. You know, it's okay to say that. But also the goal is to know somebody well enough to be engaged in their story from week to week. So I've had to really intentionally practice getting better at taking notes and writing things down. I will tell you too, is since you guys just met me, I'm at a period in my life where I've just moved states, moved jobs, meeting new people for my son's soccer team and my, and you guys and all this stuff, that I feel like I'm not really at the top of my game in terms of being able to make a continuous thread in relationship from one session or one meeting to the next. In fact, I just ran into my banker at the dog park. This is a wonderful woman. And I ran into her at the dog park and I gave her this look. I'm like, you look so familiar, but I'm sorry. And she's like, I'm so-and-so from, I work at your bank. And I'm like, oh gosh, it's so dumb. And how much of how off-putting is that if you're wanting to really be relational and connected to somebody, to just forget who they are? I hate when I do it, but it happens. So specific updates about last session, progress toward goals, that kind of stuff. I've just given you an example of how this affects us in our personal life. It happens to all of us. It's okay. Give yourself some grace. Professionally, though, this is one of those things that you probably want to pay attention to so you can get really good at not making those mistakes professionally, because that's directly relates to the effectiveness of us at our work. And I'm taking that seriously myself, too, because I don't feel like I'm doing that great of a job with you guys. Or I should say I'm doing okay, but there are some things I need to tweak in my own life to get settled in this community so that I have more space to do work, not just constantly trying to know all these people in different places. So it's a process. Let's see, encouragers, door openers. Kind of talked about a lot of these. There's some more examples on page 104. Positive, non-judgmental. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. The book does a really good job actually of just describing these and explaining them to you. So I think I'm going to leave that one just kind of for the sake of time too. Minimal encouragers, we've talked about those a little bit too. I think an important point about questioning is not listening. So when you're talking, you're not hearing. You can be observing and seeing people's reactions and that kind of stuff, but you're not listening. One of the things I notice that some of you will do is that when you're talking, and I do this all the time, I think we all do it to some degree, but when you're talking, you're really in your head about an idea and you sort of look away or you look down or you're not making eye contact. I catch myself doing this all the time. But when I'm in my head about something that I want to say and I'm not looking at you, that's just something to notice and be aware of. You may want to be thinking, am I really working too hard to come up with something really smart right now? Or do I need to just be shorten my questions and listen more? So we do questioning for a couple different important reasons, though. We need to gather information. That's important. We need to encourage depth or exploration. So one of my professors, he always hated the phrase, it's kind of cliche therapy phrase of how does that make you feel? I can't help but say it with that, how does it make you feel? That phrase or that way of saying it. But he would always get annoyed because he's nothing makes you feel a certain way. We have the capacity to feel the way we choose, regardless of how we've been running on autopilot our whole life. So he would say things like that. So we encourage depth and exploration because questions help us get to those new places, to help us feel those things, and then to understand them more so we can feel differently, right? So ways of doing that is, tell me more about that. What was that like? How'd you feel about that? That kind of stuff. Those are exploration kind of questions. I've this second to last bullet point here. Beginners ask too many questions too early. Instead, focus on questions like, what was that like? What does that mean to you? Or say more about that. And those are good primers to get away from the asking questions laterally about all the details and encouraging more depth. So that was one of the things that was asked last week of how do you know when to peel the onion back and to stay on the surface? Well, how do you know when is a different question of how do you actually do it? And this is a question of how you do it. What was that like? That must have felt strange. Can you tell me about that? Those kind of comments. And they're quick and they're just pushing it back to the client saying, I hear you, and there's more there. What's that about? Encourage. That's why they're called encouragers. Um, the book says why questions, generally not helpful, but can be later. In other words, you can ask the big questions about why later, but oftentimes clients are so confused about, they don't know why they're doing things. Sometimes I'm like, I don't know why I'm doing this. Oh yeah, now that I sit and think about it, I can understand that I would react this way because of ways I've reacted in the past, and it's worked for me at different times in life and whatever. You get the idea. But why questions are really hard, especially at the beginning. I actually use more why questions, even though people say not to, and it's intentional. I'm not going to go into it right now, but there is a place for it. But just be aware at the very beginning. If you can avoid the word why during an entire session, just as like a practice challenge for you, it's worth trying that out. Because if you find yourself being like, oh, why is that? You might be like, maybe there's a better way I can say that gets at something different that I'd like to understand. Okay, we got to be close. Oh yeah, this is the last one. Okay. Avoid leading questions unless you're assisting someone learning something. Did you feel sad after that, as an example, versus what were you feeling after that? So if you say, did you feel sad after that? You're putting that thought into someone's head. Sometimes that can be helpful to do, but again, the book is sort of giving general advice. When I'm working with people, like especially younger people or people that have less insight into a vocabulary that they could use, I'll do a little bit more suggesting to help them understand different things, especially like, do you feel shame or do you feel guilt? You know what I mean? Even when people are like, oh, I just felt bad because of the way that, like I'm so stupid that I would say such a dumb thing. And they didn't say shame or guilt, but I say, do you feel shame or guilt? And that leads to a conversation sometimes of like, what's the difference between the two? Guilt is you've done bad. Shame is you are bad. You messed up. You made a mistake. Doesn't mean you're terrible. Everybody makes mistakes, right? And so we can have that conversation later. I'm not going to go into open and close questions. I've never had a class need that explained to them. I shouldn't say that because now there's going to be somebody who's like, I don't know what that means. And I don't want you to feel bad about that. One thing I will say is that you know what it means, and many of us need refreshers of how and when to use them and reminders of what they are later on. So even if you're like, I'm not sure, it's okay. If you're like, of course I know what it means, you're probably not as good at it as you think you are. Okay. So I'll just kind of leave that there. And lastly, too many questions. People give too many questions. That's one of the challenges. Again, at the beginning, you're going to have more, but challenge yourself to slow down, step back, and ask less. If we have too many, though, what we do is we train people to become silent. And then we're like, well, tell me about this. And I ask an open question, and I've just asked 45 minutes of closed questions because I'm trying to get information. And they're like, well, what do you want to know? Like they don't know how to respond to that. Well, we may have just trained them to do the exact opposite thing that we'd like for them to do. So keep that in mind, right? It's also, I'll say this one last thing before I go, that there are lots of clients who you'll have the opportunity to, there's this sense of like learned helplessness. And learned helplessness is that you become dependent on other people because of the opportunities they give you, and they don't challenge you enough to figure things out on your own. I've done this a bunch in the class where I've said, I want you guys to have the accountability of sitting in this really ambiguous space because I need you to figure out your own style. I need you to figure out how to be okay with yourself in this really uncomfortable position. Because if I tell you all the things to say and all the things to do, and I say, just parrot back to me what I'm telling you, then you don't get to really just work through it and find your own way. And that's important, right? We have this conversation a lot at my house because I have a 7-year-old son, and I have it with parents who are asking about kids sometimes when they're actually wanting to know things versus tell me how parenting is supposed to work, which is always a fun thing. But when at home or when talking about parents, oftentimes we want to train our kids to live based on what we think is the best way to live, but we're also not training them to be independent thinkers and critical thinkers and be able to like work through hard things. It's always a big conversation with new parents who are like, my baby's crying, I have to go attend to them. And then the dad's like, well, they're never going to learn to stop crying and self-soothe if they don't do it. And there's something to that conversation, right? And it comes up over and over and over again in so many different ways. Is this my responsibility to take this on for them, or is it their responsibility to learn it, to experience it, and to grow from it? And that's a question in class. It's a question with your clients. And questions can sometimes be one of those ways in which we feel like it's our job to dig and understand and investigate, when really it's their job to learn and experience things too. Okay. Getting good at that is knowing the difference of when do you use them and when do you not. That's the trick here. And that's what practice is all about. Why you can't get everything you need from lectures. So with that said, I think that's it, right? Where's my thing? Yeah, that's it. That's the end. And we fade off into darkness. All right. Thank you guys for sticking it out for an hour and 5 minutes. And I will be back next week. Of course, feel free to ask, bring any questions you have to class. And if you're going to do your reflection after this, let me know how it went. Let me know what you thought of it. And you thought it was a good use of your time, or if we should just try and squeeze more into class or whatever. So I'll leave it there. See ya.